We're doing Brigadoon Radio, timely as ever. So it's 10 o'clock here in DC. It's 3 o'clock in London, and I guess it's 5 o'clock in Ukraine. So I think that's kind of important. We're recording this on Friday, February 25, and we'll post it later today. We're really going to try to have a discussion about, what's happening here in today's interconnected world, provide some business intelligence and some business understanding of how this all relates. Joining us today, as always, Gerald Ashley, author, advisor on risk and uncertainty. Perfect timing. Your phone must be blowing off the hook. And Doug McWilliams, who's the founder of the Center for Economic Business Research. He's also an author and he's an adventurer. We're going to talk about his road trip from Peking to Paris, which covered much of the territory we're going to talk about today. So, guys, let's get into it. As always, we're trying to get a radio contract with Area Italia. Spent extra money on the sign, so there we go. But we're going to get right into it. Ukraine. Who wants to go first? Who wants to explain what's going on in Ukraine?
I'm going to let Doug do that because he's going to have more numbers to hand than me. And I think it's very easy to end up being an armchair general. And obviously the day we're recording this is all very fast moving. But maybe, Doug, can you draw the picture for us about Russia and Ukraine?
Well, shall I start with the report that we published for the Ukrainian Ministry of Finance, which was published about a fortnight ago now? And what
absolutely. That sounds great.
And what that showed is how much the previous problems, the conflict, had already cost the Ukraine. It basically said that they have lost a fifth of their GDP as a result of this. We had to work with the Ukrainian Ministry of Finance on this report. And they were fascinating people to work with, actually, but clearly pretty scared. And they had a right to be scared because the Russians have now invaded. And I don't know how far they're going to go, but they're killing people right, left, and center. Quite a lot of Russians themselves have been killed, by the way, as this has gone through. But they wouldn't do this. They've got 160,000 troops involved in this, which is many times the size of the whole British Army. And I don't see why they wouldn't take over pretty well the whole of the Ukraine if they do this. They've started, there's been sanctions applied by the West. There will be more sanctions applied by the West, but really that's firing at them with a pea shooter. There's nothing we've done so far that would terrify the Russians. And
is it, in a way, a little bit too late? Because once these things break out, it is too late. Obviously, the deterrence wasn't there. And as you say, it's a bit of a pea shooter, just lighting up buildings in fancy colors and lots of sanctions. With the history of sanctions is not very good, is it? I mean, countries and markets adapt and get around them.
Well, the history of sanctions is not good. And I think we have to be aware that we are going to have to suffer nearly as much as the Russians if we want to hurt them. There are two key things that will distress the Russians. The first is if we cut them out of being able to finance themselves. They've probably got enough money to keep going for a couple of years, even if we do make them lose access to the financial markets. But ultimately, it will cramp their style a lot if we ban their banks, if we take them out of SWIFT, which is the clearing system, and if we make it extremely difficult for Russian companies to raise money in the West. The second thing that we can do, which will hurt us even more than banning them from finance, is we can stop buying their commodities. Now, that will take a long time before we win ourselves off, but you'll see I'm wearing a really thick sweater. And the reason I'm wearing a really thick sweater is because I've turned our central heating down. Because I believe that if everyone in the West takes a stand, what they have to do is buy less gas. And this is European-style gas, by the way, Mark, not US-style gas, which is the stuff you put in your cars. Because the Russians' key export is gas. And if we cut our own consumption of gas by 10%, it cuts the Russians' exports of gas by a fifth. That's still not enough to kill them, but it's starting to hurt them. And I think eventually we're going to have to wean ourselves off these Russian commodities, which we're going to go on to and talk about in a bit more length later, if we really want to hurt them. But we can't hurt them without hurting ourselves.
I think one remarkable thing, Mark, and I don't know if this is being picked up in the States, is the public demonstrations in Russia. I mean, that's quite a thing to do in Russia. You don't just get told off and fined $25. I mean, you can get a criminal record or get slung in prison. And they've arrested some 14 or 1,500 people. Okay, maybe that's a marginal number, but it takes a degree of bravery to do that out in the street, I would think.
No, absolutely. It's definitely been picked up, especially a lot of people that work for Secretary Hillary Clinton when she was heading up the State Department, which is interesting. This goes back to kind of Putin's cynical nature. He probably thinks that, these are some kind of psychological ops being run by the CIA or MI6, that, nobody in their right mind in Russia would go out there. But I was struck by it for sure. I mean, I was actually tweeting about it yesterday, and it's gotten a lot of media attention. And there's no doubt, to me, that's very telling. I don't think the Russians fully understand what is going on here as well. And to me, what's really interesting is all this talk about sanctions. How much pain do we want to inflict? The question is, even if this is settled by Saturday, right? Let's say Zelensky resigns, and they fly a Russian flag over Kiev. It doesn't. Putin is still there, and it seems to me like this is like the ultimate problem. Like, how committed are we to removing Putin from the Russian leadership? That, to me, nobody's really talking about that.
I think that's what we are talking about over here, and I think one of the interesting things, I don't know if any of you talked to anyone in Moscow in the past few days, but people in my office have. And they say that the surprising thing was that most Muscovites had not been prepared for this. They were nearly as shocked as we were. And I think it may be part of, let's hope it is, a sign that Putin may be losing his touch, that he hadn't really thought of preparing his own domestic opinion before he went ahead with this. But as Gerald says, the bravery must be immense to take on the KGB and so on. I mean, who knows what happens to you once you get locked up by them? It's not going to be nice. We won't get rid of Putin immediately as a result of anything that we can possibly do. He's got enough money to keep him going for a while and so on. What we can do is keep chipping away at his support. And to do that, we have to be firm. We have to keep on raising the pressure by buying less and less from him as we manage to find other ways of doing it. And most importantly, we have to stay united. And one of the reasons I've been very careful about being critical of lots of people in this with whom I would instinctively disagree is I think the moment we start fighting amongst ourselves, that's the moment when Putin starts laughing again.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. I mean, historical precedence is, of course, that leading Russia is not a job, but leads to a retirement home. I mean, it's quite a, one or two managed it. Khrushchev went off to a dacha, didn't he? And obviously Gorbachev stayed on the scene, although there was an attempted coup against him at one point. Yeah, I don't know. Putin reminds me a little bit of Julius Caesar. He's all powerful, but equally he's extremely weak personal position because he has to keep everybody around him sweet. And I'm not going to say he's going to be stabbed on the steps of the Duma or something like that, or the Kremlin. But you do wonder, looking at that now infamous sort of televised security meeting where he made everybody really like little schoolboys stand up and say, yes, I agree with everything you're doing and all the rest of it. I just wonder if bubbling under in the inner circle, if everybody's actually that keen on him. And that's going to be about body bags, isn't it? If if the Ukrainians hang on and they make it really difficult, or it turns into a partisan sort of sabotage type war rather than sort of conventional war, and the trickle of, dare one say, dead Russian soldiers just continues going back, I think that could be a factor in the future.
Gerald, yeah, I totally want to talk about that because most of my political career working on campaigns was this term called advance, where you go in and you kind of set the backdrop. You know, if the candidate is going to speak on education, you want to be at a schoolhouse. If you're going to talk about agriculture, you want a good tractor there. I was really struck by the imagery of two things. Obviously, that insane council meeting where he's, 20, 30 feet away from his, team, and they're all sitting there around a circle. And then him announcing this war by himself, sitting at a desk with these kind of antiquated phones and obsolete technology, all by himself. And then just the rambling rationalization, going back to maps a few hundred years old to justify this. I was really struck by that. I was also struck by the human ability to rationalize anything to prove your point. This is also a good reminder of all the economic behavioral activity that we all engage in. But totally struck by that. He seems very lonely, very cold. He doesn't seem like a man defiant. And your Caesar's point, I want to make a joke. Could we have in Las Vegas in 100 years' time the Putin casino? You see that happening?
No,
probably not. Okay, but I'm totally struck by the imagery that he's putting out as well. It's and the protests play into that, right? There's no way that Moscow expected this to happen. The protests in the streets.
He's an old man. He doesn't look very healthy to me. His face has exactly the same look that President Pompidou's had in the last few months of his life. And that may be a factor as well. He may be trying to do this one, maybe one for the history books.
Yeah, it's got that terrible sort of legacy feel to it. I was the man that took back Kiev and the Ukraine where it rightly belonged, if you consult the right maps and books at the appropriate time. It has got a sort of sign-off feel to it. So he'll want something that's quick, I imagine. If it could just be done really quickly, put a puppet government in, fantastic from his point of view. Everybody else is, in a dreadful way of saying this, needs to see this drag out. I mean, this is going to be dreadful for the population of the Ukraine. Both options are not really palatable.
Let's game this out. Let's say one of the scenarios, we think there's a puppet government put in there. I'm interested how you guys think the West will respond to that. Will they recognize that? Will they deal with that? And what is the business impact? Do we if there's a puppet government in place, do we suddenly start buying Russian gas again, other Russian commodities? Do we put the Formula One race back in Sochi? Or is the West prepared to say, we're not going to recognize this government, and until there's a properly democratic elected government that has the right of sovereignty, we're going to drag this out for 10, 15, possibly 20 years?
Well, it's all to play for. Past history for us is that we haven't shown huge determination. On the other hand, Western leaders have been quite aggressive with their commentary. I've been particularly impressed by the new German leader who hasn't minced his words in the way that German leaders traditionally have. He hasn't done everything he ought to have done, but he's certainly moved at a reasonable pace on Nord Stream 2. Boris Johnson, of course, tends to say things and doesn't always back them up. And that's always the danger with him. But he, again, has been actually pretty eloquent on the subject. And of course, the more they say, the more difficult it is for them to go back. So I don't mind them saying too much at this stage, because I think it does limit the extent to which they can backslide. We have the problem in Italy, where they've actually created an exception in the sanctions to send them Gucci loafers. I mean, that frankly is sickening. But most of the other people have tried reasonably hard with the normal sort of backsliding in certain parts of Europe.
I think maybe a litmus test will be BP, British Petroleum, who got a very large interest in the Russian oil industry via Rosneft, I believe. And how does that get handled? I mean, the market, we're not busy trashing the BP share price. Does the market feel it'll all kind of settle down? And what is the realpolitik of this situation? Or do the Russians kick them out? Who knows? So in a funny sort of way, if you're chairman or CEO of BP, all of this stuff is absolutely front and center. And whatever you do may give the rest of us an indication of where the, as I say, the realpolitik of all of this is. So definitely one to watch.
Well, 100%. Here in DC, the American Petroleum Institute, API, it's made up of the major oil producers, ExxonMobil, BP, the rest. They're heavily lobbying to not be wrapped up in these sanctions. If you're a CEO who's invested billions of dollars in a facility in Russia, you don't want to see that go to waste. And if your government has been comfortable with this war has been going on for 8 years, right, since 2014. If the West was cool with Crimea, why are they not cool with all of Ukraine? That is definitely being played out in the mind of CEOs, and that hasn't been fully explained to the public. And this idea of how much suffering do we really want to put the West in to ensure democracy and sovereignty is to me the really great question that nobody's really answered, and maybe we can't answer it right now.
One sort of side factor, a very minor thing, but it plays to Doug's point of we're all going to be involved in this, is that I think I'm right in saying that BP is either one of the top 3 or 4 largest dividend payers on the London Stock Exchange, and all of that flows through into people's pension funds. Nobody, the sort of ordinary person on the street doesn't even think about this stuff, but they all are probably, micro shareholders in PP and with the dividend income.
Yeah, I think I got to double check this stat. I don't know, but even the U.S. this week is bought. I don't know what the number is, but a lot of oil from Russia. It's just so interesting that we do these sanctions, and some of these sanctions, at least initially, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, shutting that off was an easy thing to do because it's not flowing. The Japanese market for Russian bonds is, to my understanding, it's small or non-existent. So, but maybe as you talked about, Doug, it's just maybe it's the daily pushback on Moscow, making it difficult. Now, Gerald, you talked about some of the color. Last night they illuminated the Empire State Building here in the States in the colors of Ukraine. Maybe that's not going to win the war overnight, but it's part of it. Moving the Champions League's game out of St. Petersburg, canceling the F1 race.
Yeah,
it's kind of a daily pestering.
I get that, but feel good stuff's not going to do it. The Instagram clever photo, the nice clip on TikTok or Twitter. This hasn't life suddenly got a lot more real? This isn't in the metaverse. This is,
the real verse.
Killed for real.
Yeah, it's the real verse.
Well,
what is your advice or Doug, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, it depends how many sweaters we're prepared to wear, really, doesn't it? I mean, if you're prepared to shiver for the Ukraine, and we're all prepared to shiver for the Ukraine, eventually we will face them down. But I wonder how tough people are prepared to be.
So, Doug, let me ask you this. So today, it's Friday. There's rumors that Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is going to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, which is a hugely political move, and it shows to America it's business as usual. Democracy is going on. On Tuesday, March 1st, the president will be speaking State of the Union. It's going to go up to Capitol Hill. What are your thoughts on that? At that speech, for example, will you be disappointed if Biden doesn't say, hey, it's time to put on a sweater? Here's the real situation. Will that be a missed opportunity?
I think for the United States, what we're looking for is not so much sweaters, because there's less of a linkage between the US gas market. You don't even call it the same thing. We're talking about a slightly different product from what's traditionally called gas in the US. But so it's not so much put on a sweater in the United States. What we're looking for from the United States is strong support for NATO and a long-term commitment to NATO, which probably means troops on the ground in the Baltic states and probably in Poland as well. That's what we're looking for. from the United States. It's we Europeans who are going to have to put on sweaters and to work to cut our dependence on Russian goods of all kinds.
One thought, Doug, you mentioned the SWIFT payment system, and I thought instantly, yeah, that's a really good idea. But on reflection, is that really the case? Because will it weaken the role of the US dollar in the global economy over a period of time?
Only very slowly, because it will only take out the Russian element of it. And I don't think we're in a world where the renminbi is going to take over very quickly because of the historic weaknesses. The Chinese have been pushing this for yonks, something like 15 years now, and they've never quite been able to make it work because they can't make the renminbi fully convertible. And they're actually moving away from making the renminbi fully convertible. So I don't think the role of the dollar will decline that much. Obviously, it has to decline a little bit if you take out the trade in oil, particularly, which is the main thing that will be affected if you take them out of SWIFT. Actually, it does appear that the sanctions we placed on Russian banks have made it much more difficult to purchase Russian oil anyway. So some of these things, you don't actually have to operate SWIFT. And to make take the Russians out of SWIFT, you have to get agreement in the EU, you have to get agreement in the US, you have to get agreement in the UK. And it's not as easy a thing as it might be, whereas sanctioning Russian banks, you can do very quickly.
Is this the old phrase that the speed of the convoy is as slow as ship? So to actually get agreement on anything in the West is kind of a bit painful. And maybe with SWIFT it would, excuse the pun, but it would take a long time. It wouldn't be easy to get it to happen.
Well, I imagine in the international negotiations, there's quite a lot of arm twisting happening at the moment. I mean, this is the stuff you don't do publicly. You don't want to humiliate people in public. And I assume one of the reasons that they made the exception for the Gucci shoes is because they're asking the Italians to do something else. But I still don't think the Italians should have asked for it.
Well, I love Gucci shoes, so I don't know if they were selling less to Russia, maybe it would have made them cheaper. But let's talk about, these are good points. I want to bring in, I always use this phrase, politics is the art of what's possible, right? There are plenty of things that can be done, but is it possible for a number of factors? And operating in a democracy where people have the right to vote and express their opinions, things can be very hard. And your point there about Doug, about the public and the private negotiations, just because what is said publicly doesn't mean other things aren't being said privately. Privately, let's pivot to Asia, to Russia. And I'm sorry, let's pivot to China and Xi Jinping. I can't imagine in Xi Jinping's 2022 rollout for his third term as president of the Middle Kingdom that he expected a war in Europe. And he's now buddy with Putin. So what do we think about Xi Jinping, China? Are they liking this? Are they not liking this? Is it part of the plan? Is it part of the master 100-year strategic plan for China?
Doug, you can have a go on that one.
Okay. Well, let me go first. The Chinese don't like surprises, and this is a bit of a surprise. So they won't like it. They prefer to have their master plan, their 5-year plan, whatever it is, laid out in meticulous detail. On the other hand, it's quite an interesting test, because if it shows the West not to be resolved, it makes the Chinese issue, which is Taiwan, possibly easier for them to resolve. So they'll see advantages and disadvantages in it. But my sense is that they would not have wanted the Russians on what to them is a relatively minor matter. And in terms of the world economy, Ukraine, although it's important for a series of commodities, is still quite a small part of the world economy. They would not want the Ukraine to be to solidify the West and build up the potential reaction that might mean that if the Chinese take action over Taiwan, we're already united. They would rather have seen us as divided whenever they decide to make a move on Taiwan.
Yeah,
Joe, before I bring you in here, the Taiwan issue, I want to point out, the Taiwanese actually issued sanctions as well on the Russians, and the State Department briefing here in the States yesterday, the spokesperson made it clear that Taiwan was part of the sanctions, which I don't think was by accident. Gerald, over to you.
I was just going to say one of the sort of byproducts of all of this is that Putin may actually have re-energized NATO and the West. I tend to be a bit pessimistic about lots of these sort of multilateral, multinational organizations. They often do sort of speak with different voices, and that, as Doug said earlier, is what we really need to avoid. And I think the whole world now must be concerned that we can forget about the rule of international law. It's all about who's got the power, and military, food production, energy, all sorts of things. And I think it may, and I would say hopefully, make the West reevaluate the way we're running our world and our economies, because we're very reliant in some areas on things that are not reliable, could be quite fragile, in fact.
Can we actually, I get these, our prop department made these great cards. Let's talk about agriculture, because not only does that connect China, Europe, even the United States, food production. Gerald, you've got some interesting insights on the agriculture and the fertilizer. Yeah, before you go, China apparently has they have a huge plot of land. I've heard the size of Belgium and Ukraine, the rights to agriculture there as well. Talk about agriculture and fertilizer in the Ukraine.
Well, the one that struck me, and just kind of looking down at the numbers here, is sunflower oil. This was new to me. A large proportion of sunflower oil in your local supermarket has come from Ukraine. Maybe we will have to learn to cook with something else. Maybe more seriously, is a large part of the world fertilizer production is in Russia and Ukraine, and that's either going to be unavailable or very expensive, and I presume that's going to feed through in some way into inflation. And maybe this is Doug's point, that the cost we're going to feel, well, we may feel it on all fronts, mightn't we? Are we going to have to increase? Are we going to have to increase defense spending? Are we going to have more inflation? And energy is just going to get, really expensive. Time to buy those sweaters, Doug.
Yeah, and it's not even just that, because it's all coming at the same time. Normally, we could probably increase our spending on defense without necessarily covering it fully with taxes. But at the moment, with demand way outstripping supply, I don't think we can do that. That would just give a further and rather dangerous twist to inflation if we did that. So I think if we want to spend more on defense in the West, and this seems to make it necessary that we do so, we are going to have to spend good money on our defense, and that will have to come from higher taxes, I'm afraid, or from cutting public spending elsewhere, which does not at the moment seem something that people are very keen to do. So you've got your agriculture, you've got your sunflower, you've got your fertilizer, you've got the wheat, of course, because we're talking about the traditional center of the world's wheat production. You've got all these things that will be affected by this. You've got the energy, which we're trying to reduce our dependence on. It's a real hit. I mean, my early maths said that it wouldn't take much to pull the world economy into recession on the back of all this. So that's potentially quite a hit, on top of having to put on our extra sweaters. And sorry, can I just make two other very quick points? One,
absolutely.
I guess probably the Fed and other central banks are actually going to be a bit more cautious about tightening. And I think that may be quite important. And the second is it may get governments off the hook a bit on the cost of living squeeze.
Oh,
I was going to go ahead, Joe.
It gives them a story to say, look, if this hadn't all blown up, your food and energy bills wouldn't be so high. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Well, in classic government fashion, Bloomberg has a story how the Department of Agriculture here in the States, quote, warns fertilizer firms on price gouging over Ukraine. But in the same story, the Secretary Vilsack, downplays the war impact on U.S. inflation. So that seems to me like they're saying two things at the same time, but it's too early to be worried about inflation. Getting back to the State of the Union, it will be interesting. Yeah, Doug, I hear your point. President Biden clearly is going to has to make a strong sense of strong support for NATO. But does he touch on inflation? Especially, as you know, we have an election here in the States in, 10 months time. How does that play into it? Inflation is dominating the news coverage, and this certainly doesn't help. Will he touch that? Will the leaders in the West ask us to put on more sweater, ask us to expect more higher prices? It's unlikely, but the public's going to notice.
Well, don't they play it the other way, which is to say this is why it's happening. It's not our fault. It's President Putin, and start backsliding a bit and sort of working their way out of it. I have a nasty feeling that actually it's not entirely against Joe Biden's interest to lose the midterms, because it gives him people who are probably rather more closely aligned with his own thinking in terms of international policy and so on. So he may not be quite as upset as some people think. The people in Congress at the moment are not entirely respectable, are they? So it might just be that he gets what he wants in a silly way by losing.
There's a great, I'm going to butcher it. There's a great Mark Twain quote regarding, if I wanted to join a organized party, I wouldn't join the Democrats. Let's take something more fun if you guys are up for it. Are you up for it?
Of course. Definitely. We're always up for fun.
We've got the author of the book, Driving the Silk Road. Let me get this great prop. Doug, tell us your story. I love these road trips. Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. You drove a Bentley with your brother halfway across the world. Was it 2019 you did the drive?
Yeah, and at the time I wondered if it would ever happen again. Since then, China's been closed down, so they delayed the next one, which was meant to be this year. They delayed it by a year, and it seems highly unlikely that the Russian leg would be open again. If you're trying to drive from Beijing to Paris, which has only been done 7 times as a rally, you have to go through China and Russia. So these places are shut. The rally simply doesn't happen. The reason I wanted to do it was partly because I'm mad on cars, but also partly because I wanted to see the Silk Road that's meant to be emerging, the overland route from Asia through to Europe. And
yeah, we're talking about, it's 16,000 kilometers, close to 10,000 miles. This is, for perspective, here in the States, that's, LA to DC is like 3,300 miles, right? So that's three times the distance, huge distance.
Yeah. Wow. That's assuming you go straight and you don't get lost. So it's a bit more than that.
That's a good point. What did you allocate? I like the side story there. What did you allocate extra miles? That's pretty funny.
No, we actually went 40% of the distance around the world in total. So the title of the book is Halfway Around the World. It's slightly cheating, but we went 40% of the distance around the world. It's much worse than that, because one of the bits of it, which is traditional and goes back to the race's original purpose in 1907, when it was first held, is you actually go across the Gobi Desert on camel tracks.
Wow.
And that is the mad bit. You camp in the desert and you get filled from actually ex-Cold War surplus tankers who turn up at the camps, and then you get a certain amount, an allocation of petrol. And it is quite extraordinary. And the Gobi Desert shatters your car. By the time we got to the end, the steering was broken, the suspension was broken, the brakes were broken, and so on. You end up in Novosibirsk, which is in Siberia. And in Siberia, you rebuild your car. And then you try and make your way through the rest of the rally, driving all the way across Russia. Well, 3 vignettes. The first is this, the amount of trade going between China and Russia is rising exponentially.
Yeah.
The second thing is this Silk Road is transforming, all the road development and so on, is transforming the economies of particularly Kazakhstan and Mongolia. These places are stuffed with minerals. And the problem with minerals is not so much, their existence, it's getting them from where they exist, which is always somewhere fairly remote, to somewhere where people can use them. And that's particularly, the main place people want to use them is in China. And these roads are making it possible. They are life-changing for those two economies. Now, the third thing is very germane to what we've been talking about, because we've been talking about Russia. On all previous occasions, people have been kidnapped, people have been stopped, and by barricades, by people pretending to be policemen, have then stolen $1,000 for them to ransom them. They've been bumped into by drunks, etc. This time, there were no drunks and there were no crooks. We didn't even see working girls. I mean, it was all really clean, all really cleaned up.
And you tie that to the prosperity that because of the Belt and Road or the economic development that's happening?
Well, it looks as if Russia, it's not just the Belt and Road, Russia has transformed itself in a way that's not fully picked up in the statistics. Now, I went on a Foreign Office briefing before I went on the rally, and one of the things they observed was there are nearly 1 million different enterprises in Russia that sell software to the UK alone each year.
Good Lord.
Now, none of that, I suspect, appears in GDP, but if they're good at hacking, they're probably good at coding. I mean, they're two relatively similar skills. And my guess is that the Russian economy is quite a lot more successful than the numbers suggest. Their life expectancy has already gone up nearly 10 years from the bottom just after, when Yeltsin was around and when everyone was boozing their heads off. I mean, the life expectancy got down to the 60s. It's well into the 70s, even for men now. And they seem to be back as a much more sophisticated place than you might imagine. Now, what I said in the book is if you're scared of the Russians, you need to be a lot more scared. And that brings us back to the Ukraine.
So does that, if there's more prosperity than we appreciate, does that make Putin's position, I wonder, stronger or weaker? Stronger in the sense that people are feeding themselves and getting on in the world, weaker in the sense they don't want to be represented by the guy in the Kremlin.
There's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, I think that it does look as if either they've nationalized the gangsters or they've taken them under control. I mean, genuinely, there were no roadblocks, no cars got stopped, no one got ripped off. We were told to take $20,000 in a safe for bribes and for looking after people. We didn't, in fact, use any of it for that. We used some of it for car repairs, but that's a different matter.
How do you get a Bentley repaired in Novosibirsk? I mean, there's no dealership, I presume.
Well, there is a dealership actually,
Good
but
Lord.
we didn't go to the dealership because the Bush mechanics are amazing. We had broken a steering pin. Think of something about the thickness of your finger and about twice the length. That had completely sheared, and the front wheel was at this angle. And the guy took the bits and he got some metal and cast one and made one up for him. For us, he charged us $70, which I thought was a deal. There weren't gangsters and people like that. So Putin gets the gratitude of those whose living standards have gone up. And I suspect in areas like Siberia, they're probably more grateful than they might be in, say, St. Petersburg. On the other hand, obviously, as you point out, demand for freedom of speech, democracy, that kind of thing, tends to be a luxury good. You tend to get much more interested in it as you get more sophisticated and more wealthy. So I think it cuts both ways for him.
Could you draw a quick picture for us on Mongolia, which I think for most people is just a big lump of land between China and Russia, and other than it used to be a very agrarian sort of setup. What's going on in Mongolia?
Well, first of all, they've got any mineral just about that you can think of. And in fact, the biggest current export is coal, because there's open cast coal right at the surface. They just have to, you don't have to dig down, you can just pick it up and sell it. The second thing is Mongolia is not flat. And in fact, we had to drive over a peak of 2,600 meters on the way out of it. And we actually had to go all the way up and then all the way down. We had to go down without any brakes, which was interesting. And we could only do this by swinging the car around and bashing the side of it against the side of the road, against walls on the side of the road to slow the car down. Otherwise, we would have picked up speed a little bit too rapidly, because by then all three braking systems had failed. Mongolia, it gets amazingly cold in the winter. Fortunately, we were there in the summer. It wasn't boiling hot in the summer. But you're talking about minus 35 centigrade, minus 35, minus 40. They don't have cows. And why don't they have cows? They get their milk and their meat from horses, because apparently horses survive the cold weather much better than cows do. So you look around and there are flocks and flocks of horses, which they keep instead of cows. But one other interesting thought, the children, I think, were the happiest children I've ever seen anywhere in my life. And I guess the reason for it is the parents just let them run wild. They know they'll come home at some point, and they're not scared of anything. And the place is the most underpopulated place in the world. And the children just run around, and they seem to be huge smiles on their faces. They all looked amazingly happy, and they're pretty well fed, because there's a lot of protein around. They've all got plenty of, because the ratio of land to people is so high, and because the ratio of flocks of various sorts of food to people is so high, they're pretty well fed. And they're a pretty hefty lot who win Olympic medals for wrestling and weightlifting and things like that. And God knows if they ever take up rugby, then we'll get some amazing front row forwards.
Wonderful.
So I think two things. I'm a huge advocate of, like, obviously travel and experiencing stuff. Like, if you haven't seen anything, it's really hard to know what's going on. Of course, you could read about it, but seeing it with your own eyes and tasting it and smelling the culture is super important. Just even your remarks about the amount of software and the technology and the coding that's going on in Russia, and the inability for GDP to properly capture software is a huge problem. I found that super interesting. So it's amazing you did that journey. What's your next one? You have any interest going from Argentina to Alaska, doing the Western Hemisphere?
Well, there is a rally for that, but I don't think we'll go in it. No, we're going to do a simple one. I promised the car, and if you make a promise to a car, you can't ever let yourself down. I promised the car I would never torment it in such a way. So I bought myself a 1930s Jaguar, and I'm going to rally that around Greek temples in Greece and Italy.
That sounds very civilized. What's the advice you can give to tell, the important people in your life, hey, I'm going to do a rally. I'm going to be gone. I'm going on this adventure. How do you get buy-in from the principals in your life? Any advice?
That's a very good question. The next time I've decided to take her with me. And I'm training her at the moment in the intricacies. You probably don't know very much about tulip maps, and there's no reason you should. They are ways of that the rally directors send you around. The only important thing to know about them is that they're unidirectional. So if you get lost, you have to go all the way back until you find yourself, and then start all over again, because there's no other way of doing it. You're not allowed to use sat-nav or anything, except in the desert we were, and they gave us the sat-nav equipment that people normally use when they're sailing around the world, because they realized it would be too dangerous if we didn't have any sat-nav equipment. And so we used that. But even that was, it's fairly rudimentary, because there aren't roads, really.
All right. Gerald, are you ready for our final segment?
Well, we normally inflict our cultural views on people, don't we? There we are. And well,
what are we reading? What are we watching?
I'm not really watching anything particularly, other than listening to a sort of rock song by Liam Gallagher that's just come out, which I quite like, called "Everything's Electric."
Look at you.
That may be
Manchester, the Oasis boys. I love it.
Yeah, maybe a reflection of my slightly elderly taste in music, but it sort of appeals to me. And in terms of reading, I'm not reading it because I'm still nearly at the end of Peter Frankopan's book on the Silk Roads, which we've been talking about now into episode 3, but it is 550 pages or whatever. But off the bookshelf, and I think it's sort of apposite at the moment, I've got this one, and it'll come up on the
yes.
it'll come up on the show notes. It's the Manias, Panics and Crashes by Charles Kindleberg. I think it was written in the mid-70s. It'll never go out of date. You can just thumb open at any page, and you can recognize something you will have known in your own lifetime or period in the markets. So there we go.
It's a wonderful book, that. I've got it as well. And of course, Charles Kindleberger was one of the key people who taught us when I was doing my undergraduate degree.
There we are. Lovely segue there. Perfect.
Shall I come
So,
into?
yeah, do you have a recommendation?
Checkmate in Berlin. The Cold War Showdown That Shaped the Modern World by Giles Milton. I'm reading it on Kindle, I'm afraid. That tells the story of the Berlin airlift.
Oh, wow.
And the Berlin airlift, if you want to think about how you resist tyranny, then this actually sort of shapes your mind a bit. And a lot of it was luck, we have to say. However, it did eventually happen, and General Lucius Clay, played a major role. Now, just as an odd thing, coincidence, there was, in the Berlin airlift, there was an American pilot who dropped candy to the kids in Berlin, the candy bomber, they called him, Gail Harbison. And I just noticed this morning at lunchtime when I was reading the Times obituaries that the poor man had just died, and the whole story of the candy bomber. He used to drop candy with little parachutes on it for the children of Berlin. And he made his name as the candy bomber. So sad that he's died, but so wonderful that he's recognized.
You mentioned Giles Milton. I'll just put in a quick recommendation from him. He's a great author. And I think, Mark, you'll love this one. It's called Nathaniel's Nutmeg. And it's a book about the spice trade in the 16th and 17th century. And in still what must be one of the greatest deals in world history, where the Dutch did a deal with the English over an island, a spice island, which I think is called Run. I mean, who even remembers Run? And the English gave it up, and they took a piece of land that nobody thought was worth very much, called Manhattan. You'll enjoy that book.
I love it. I love Manhattan. I didn't know that story. That's good. I'm going with a good segue on geography. We all know this, Tim Marshall, a good
That's
friend.
a brilliant book.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
it starts off with obviously China and Russia in there. But yeah, I mean,
isn't the opening quote, "What is Putin's biggest fear is some plane in the Ukraine or something"? I mean, I'm forcing you to find a page, but he's absolutely bang on the money with the current situation.
He's a fellow author for Reaction Life, and he was the speaker we had when we had our house dinner at, I'm sorry, this is showing off, Hatfield House, the Marquis of Salisbury's really tremendous stately home, palace in fact it is, and Tim Marshall was our speaker, and he was very good too.
Wow.
Yeah, we're all fans, I guess, aren't we?
Yeah.
No, it's absolutely, and he's and it was a super informative book, and even just the way, if you're a budding author, the way he lays out his books and does his writing is quite good. All right, boys, gentlemen, hopefully we'll have good news. Thanks for making the time. Hopefully we provided some good insights. Hopefully our friends in Italy will be watching and picking us up. And
so that's two now. That's Rye and Gucci, presumably, is it?
Oh yeah, we need to work in every Italian brand. Exactly.
Yeah. And don't worry about my comments about Draghi. I dare say he will have been doing other good things to help the alliance.
No, but your points about the Fed, the world banks, the central banks, how they're going to handle all this stuff, super timely. So hopefully we provided some intelligence and insights for our audience that wasn't too damaging, and hopefully we stay positive. And when we see each other in a few weeks' time, we'll be living probably in a different world, I would guess.
Yeah, I must just say thanks, Doug. It's really good to come on, and I'm still worried about the bodywork on your Bentley.
It's all been redone.
Yeah, Doug, I'll be ordering that book quite quickly. I love the idea of a good road trip book. One of my favorite books was written by Tim Cahill, and he drove from Argentina to Alaska. It's called Road Fever, and he lived on beef jerky for weeks on end, and we didn't even touch about your diet on your road trip, but I imagine it was a bit rustic.
It wasn't actually. We were totally well looked after and it's important you do this, because imagine you're camping in the desert. There are 5 latrines for about 250 people. You really don't want to give them a tummy upset.
Yeah.
And on virtually every previous rally, they had tummy upsets, which must have been, really unpleasant, as you can imagine. This time, there were no problems like that. And in fact, our medics had so little work that eventually the day after the mechanics party, which is the day when everyone was hungover, they ran over someone's foot and made their own business that way.
Well, that is a good ending for this episode. That was great. All right, guys, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.